my pleasure to introduce our very special guest, Lynda Cohen Loigman. She graduated from Harvard College and Columbia Law School. Her debut novel, The Two-Family House, was a USA Today bestseller and the nominee for the Goodreads 2016 Choice Awards in Historical Fiction. Her second novel, The Wartime Sisters, was selected as a Women's World Book Club pick and a Best Book of 2019 by Real Simple magazine. Her third novel, The Matchmaker's Gift, was named the Best New Book by People magazine and a Best Book of Fall by the New York Post, Parade magazine, BuzzFeed, and GoodMorningAmerica.com. And without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Lynda Cohen Loigman.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to see so many of you here. I'm completely thrilled. I love libraries. I spent all my summers. I grew up in Western Massachusetts. I spent all my summers. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
I spent all my summers at my library doing like the library program. You know, like they gave you had to read 10 books for the summer or whatever it was. And I am so grateful to Christina and everyone here at the library for inviting me. I'm so thrilled to see all your happy faces. And if you did bring a book with you, I'm happy to sign that too at the end. I'm going to tell you kind of what I'm going to do here. So I have a slideshow. I have a lot of old photographs that I found during the course of my research for this book. I also have I have one personal photograph that will be in the beginning. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you why it was that I wrote this book. I'm going to tell you about the inspiration for it and the research for it and some of the history behind it, and take you on a little journey in my head, which might be kind of scary, but we're going to do it anyway. And then at the end, I'm going to take questions. So we'll have time for a Q&A, and I'm an open book. You can pretty much ask me anything. So this book was my COVID book. This was the book that I wrote during COVID. And I think a lot of the books that you're reading now are books that somebody wrote during COVID. But a couple things happened that made me write this book. And if you have read my first two books, you know that this one is a little bit of a departure for me. It's a lot more joyful, which makes me really happy. My first two books were sort of more serious and a little bit darker. And this book is sort of a beam of light. And it started, though, at a very dark time. So here's my first little photograph. Okay. You guys see that? Okay, so in March of 2020, my daughter was a junior in college, and she called me on a Tuesday, crying hysterically, and said, "We just got the email, and they're shutting everything down, and we have 5 days to get out of the dorm." So the March of 2020 picture is literally the day she came home. So she said, "Can I bring home my roommate, Adele?" My daughter's name is Ellie, her roommate is Adele. And the first picture, I made them a drink. They were 21 at the time, so it was okay. I made myself what is not pictured as me, also drinking a very large drink, because they were smiling, but it was pretty rough. It was a pretty rough, first couple of days. The next picture is a great picture because it was their graduation. It was a year late to graduation, but as you can see, those are like real, true happy smiles. So Adele is like our second daughter now. She's on the family group chat. She's part of the family. So a couple things happened when the girls came home that led me to write this book. The first thing was, I was living at home with my son, who at the time was a senior in high school, and my husband. It was a house of men and me. And then the girls came home and I had 2 extra women around the dinner table. And I don't want to say that my conversations with my husband and my son were like not the greatest, but they were not the greatest. So the girls came home and I had these 2 really intelligent, really brilliant, absolutely ambitious, fascinating young women to speak to. And our dinner table conversations changed and they were elevated. And also because we had a guest in our house, like we were all on our best behavior. So we had dinner every night. Like we could have all taken our food and gone to like different corners of the house. We had dinner together every night for 6 months. And so what happened was we were talking about women's issues in a way that hadn't really been happening around my table. And they were asking me, I had been a lawyer, they wanted to know about my experiences as a lawyer, they wanted to know about did I experience what were my horror stories of being a woman in a law firm? And I had a couple. What was it like for me? What was it like for me in college? And they were telling me about their concerns and their worries and some of the things that they were facing in school. And if you've read this book, show of hands, how many people have read the book? Okay, so most of you have read the book. So this is a story about a woman who is trying to find her place in a professional world dominated by men. And so the reason for a lot of thematically what you see in this story came really out of those conversations with my daughter and her roommate. That was where my head was at. But I still wasn't going to write about a matchmaker. I was just having these conversations. And then we started binge watching. And our first binge watch, like you all binge watch whatever you watched during COVID, right? So our first was called Indian Matchmaking on Netflix, right? Did you guys watch that? And now they're coming out with Jewish matchmaking. Okay. So Jewish matchmaking is next, but at the time we only had Indian matchmaking. And P.S., the woman who is the matchmaker for Jewish matchmaking is someone that I spoke to. She was the woman that I called about when I wanted to talk to a modern matchmaker for this book, and she was very helpful and very interesting. Anyway, at the end of watching all of the episodes of Indian Matchmaking, Adele turns to me and she pulls this up for me on her phone. She said, my grandmother was an Orthodox Jewish matchmaker in Brooklyn. Oh, no. Right? And this is a picture of Adele's grandmother. This is from a 1977 New York Times article. And it was called, if you can't read it, called Finding a Find, Catching a Catch for Brooklyn's Orthodox Jews. So I read this article, and it was not just about Adele's grandmother, it was about a bunch of different matchmakers at the time. But I just thought it was so fascinating. I had never really thought about it before. I mean, here was the Indian matchmaking show. And the interesting thing is, of course, there's matchmaking in every tradition you can think of. Because since I put this book out into the world, people from all different religions and all different backgrounds have written to me and told me about the matchmaking in their communities. But I hadn't really given it a lot of thought. I knew about it. I knew about Yenta from Fiddler on the Roof, and I think I have, there's my Yenta picture. So this is what I knew of matchmaking. But the more that I read that article, and there was something about a file cabinet in that article, and it made me think of that book from the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil Lee Frankwell. Remember that book? And I thought, well, that would be such a funny story, wouldn't it? Like, there's a matchmaker, and she has a file cabinet. And then it falls over and all the matches get mixed up. And that would be such a great story. And she matches all the wrong people, right? That was not the book that I wrote, but that was sort of an idea. And it was in my head, and I couldn't get it out of my head. And I live in my head a lot of the time. So I was working on a different book at the time. And it was a lot more similar to my first two books. And I had a check-in call with my agent. And I talked to her, and we talked about that book. And I said, listen, just so you know, I am going to write my next book about a matchmaker. I don't know what it's really going to be, but that's going to be my next book. And we talked about it for a little bit, and I told her about Adele, and, I wanted to know how she was, health-wise. We were all really worried at that point. We were, stuck in our houses. And she called me the next day, and she said, Lynda, I can't stop thinking about this matchmaker book, this idea. I'm so excited about it. I'm going to talk to your editor. And I'm going to see what she says. And maybe we'll do a 2-book deal, because I had a 1-book deal for the book that I was working on. And then a few days later, she called me and she said, we both are so excited about this book. We want this book, and we want you to write it now. We want you to put that other book on hold and write this book now. And I think about that a lot, because why? That's a very unusual thing to happen. Why did they want it right then? And I think, we write books and we read books sometimes. Sometimes books come to us, whether if we're thinking about writing them or reading them, we feel lucky. They find us at the right time, right? Sometimes there are books that just hit us at the right time. And that book, the idea of the matchmaker book, was what they wanted to read right then. Because we were at a point where we were so disconnected as humans that they wanted to read a book about connection. And a book about a matchmaker. That's what a matchmaker does. She makes connections. That's what they do. So I kind of had my marching orders. I was told, Lynda, go write a matchmaker book. I had nothing to go on. I didn't know the time period. I didn't know anything about what I was going to write. And honestly, I was excited, but I was a little bit worried, because if you say, write a book about a matchmaker, it sounds a lot like a romance, doesn't it? I mean, of course it does. And I don't write romance, I write historical fiction. So I had to figure out how I was going to come at a Matchmaker book from a historical point of view. And of course there would be some romance in it, there would be some love in it, that's what a Matchmaker does, but I really wanted to figure out the history behind it. And I wanted to bring something to it that was different from everything else that, all the other Matchmaker books that you might have read, that maybe are romances or whatever they are. So I had to start doing my research. And usually when I write a book, I do a couple months of research. So I knew I had a couple months of research ahead of me, but I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't leave my house really. And I wanted to go to New York, but I live about an hour north of New York City. So I wasn't gonna go into New York City at that time. So I started researching online. And I hit all of the highlights. I went to the New York Public Library online. I went to the Jewish Museum online, the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I did a lot of research with the Tenement Museum online, which has great resources. And then finally, I kind of hit my jackpot at the museum at Eldridge Street, which is, if some of you, sounds like some of you have heard of it, the museum at Eldridge Street is this beautiful old synagogue on the Lower East Side. You can still visit it. It has amazing stained glass windows. They have events there. And online, they had this online exhibit thing, whatever it was, and it was called Love on the Lower East Side. So it's perfect, right? And in Love on the Lower East Side, they talked about a wedding that took place on Rivington Street in 1909. And it was the wedding of a woman named Ethel Karp, who was the daughter of a Romanian immigrant. And he was known as the Pickle Millionaire of New York, which of course is the inspiration for my Pickle King of New York, right? So the Pickle Millionaire of New York was this very wealthy man. And this wedding had like 2,000 people. And there was a line in this thing that I found at the Museum of Eldridge Street website that was from a New York Times article. And so I had to go find the article, right? So here's the article. You're not really gonna be able to read it, but the headline of this is Karp Wedding Glory Dazzles East Side. And I thought there were so many strange and wonderful things about this article. So the first is the line that just hit me right in the fishkies, as my grandmother would say. The line was, at this wedding, the scent of roses and orange blossoms mingled with the odors of dried herring and pickles. So, like, what a line that is. I wrote it out, I sent it to my editor, and I said, this is my story. I want it to be roses and pickles. I wanted all the beauty of the orange blossoms and all the grit and sourness of the dried herring, right? This is what I want my book to be. I don't want it to be just a romance. I want it to be something else. So that was one of the things about this article. The other thing was, well, first of all, why is the New York Times even writing this big, this was a big article. It wasn't just like a little mention. I didn't know that they would be printing like things about immigrant weddings. Like that I thought was really interesting. Ethel Karp went to Barnard. Like in 1909, she was a first generation, daughter of an immigrant at Barnard College. I thought that was really interesting. And in my story, Sarah goes to Barnard. And of course, some people said, well, that's, completely not believable. No one in her position would have gone to Barnard. But guess what? Like they did. So I did a lot of research about that. But what I thought was the really most strange thing about this article was there's some paragraph in here that says, this match was not made by an old world matchmaker. They met themselves, it wasn't made by a matchmaker, and they used the Yiddish word for matchmaker. In the New York Times article, they used the word shadchan. It sounded an awful lot like, they're protesting too much. And I figured if they wanted to write a whole paragraph about how they weren't matched by a matchmaker, chances are they were matched by a matchmaker. That's my personal opinion. But also this Yiddish word, I hadn't heard of it at that point. I had heard the word shidduch, that word I knew, the word for a match. But I didn't know the word for matchmaker. So I figured, why don't I'm gonna just put it in the New York Times Time Machine archives and see if there are other things. And then I came up with this one. Rates for husbands on the increase. Right? Which is so funny. And then I think it says prices for desirables now run as high as $25,000. So the East Side shotgun set. So I think the $25,000 bit was kind of like what we call clickbait today. Like I'm sure there was maybe one or two where somebody paid $25,000 because it was a percentage of the dowry. But I think $25,000 back then, when this article was written, is like $750,000. So I don't think that was typical at all. But this article gave me two really fascinating bits of information, which were the most surprising things that I learned. And it also really helped me figure out the book. They said that at this time, in 1910, in New York City, there were over 5,000 professional Jewish matchmakers. 5,000. And the bulk of them were men. And when I learned these two facts, all of a sudden, I had a story. Because I was not going to write about a man. I knew I was going to be writing about a woman. I knew that she was going to be competing against all these men. I knew that she was going to have a gift that they did not have. I knew that she was going to be fighting to use this gift. And all of those conversations with my daughter and her roommate were coming back to me. She wasn't gonna get paid as fairly. She was gonna be doing this out of the goodness of her heart. How many of us women, I'm very grateful for you, all of you men in the audience, but mostly I see a lot of women out here. How many of us have done many, many things out of the goodness of our heart and don't get paid for them? I knew that all of the struggles that my matchmaker, was going to have were going to resonate even with young people today, even with all of us today, because the more things change, the more they stay the same. Things get better, but they don't change completely. So all of a sudden, I had a conflict. I had, the beginnings of a story. I knew what my character's fight was going to be. And I knew that this was the time period I wanted to write about. Because I could have written about the 1970s. I knew it was going to be a grandmother-granddaughter story. So I was going to have two time periods, right? But I could have had the 1970s, like Adele's grandmother, and then this, now, today, modern times. I could have had the 1950s. Like, how many of you have seen the Mrs. Maisel matchmaking story, right? So I finished my book, and it was a print, and then I saw that episode, and everyone was emailing me and texting me, did you see the Mrs. Maisel episode? I could have written about that. Everyone loves the 1950s. I love the 1950s. But when I read these facts, and I read these articles, and I could see it, and I could taste it, and I could smell it, and then I knew this was my time period. I was going to write about the 1910s and 1920s on the Lower East Side. And of course, once I had that, there was only so many, it locked me into a time period for the granddaughter. And it just so happened that I graduated from law school in 1993. And I was a young lawyer in 1994, the same way that Abby is. So that all kind of worked really nicely for this book. And I felt like it was a shift, right? It was my fate to write this book in those time periods. And also, even the whole idea of my daughter's roommate coming home. I mean, I'm grateful for her every day, for a lot of reasons, because she's a wonderful friend. But, you never know what's going to happen, right? We don't know the path that our life is going to take. And so, if you had told me before COVID that I was going to write a book about a matchmaker, I would have said, that sounds really weird. I don't think so. But here we are. So, I knew my time period, and then I kind of knew my place, right? I was going to be writing about the Lower East Side. When you build a book, when you write a piece of historical fiction, you're building a world. When you write any book, you're building a world, but when you write historical fiction, you're really, truly trying to get the details of that world right. So this is the background. This picture was what was in my head when I thought about the Lower East Side at that time. We have the push carts. We have the horses and carriages. We have the tenements. Everybody's crowded. Everybody's screaming for this or that item. They're bantering in the street. They're smushed into these tiny little apartments. This is what I pictured. So I kind of knew what I was dealing with, but I didn't really. I didn't have the details. And I didn't know who are my specific people. Like, you need the broad picture, but you also need the specifics, right? Like, I can't just give you this picture and say, here's my book, that's it. Who was my matchmaker even matching? Like, I had to know that. Who were the people that she was going to be meeting every day? Like, the Mr. Rogers song, like, who are the people in my neighborhood? Like, who are they? So I just started researching, kind of just reading people's stories, I read a lot of memoirs about the Lower East Side, about women who lived there, when they were girls in the 1920s. I learned about this man. So this was my first man that I was the first story I got really excited about. This is Hyman Muscat, and some of you might have Muscat's eyeglasses even now. Because he still makes these eyeglasses. There's still a Muscat's eyeglass store on the Lower East Side, on Rivington Street. So I learned about this man. He came here, he was an immigrant, he sold spectacles from a push cart, like my Mr. Tunkel in my story. He became the inspiration for that character. And eventually he opened up a brick and mortar store on Rivington Street. The reason that I loved this story was because it just sparked something in my mind. And I realized, you know what? Think about all the ways that we talk about love. It's all vision related. We say they fell in love at first sight. We say that love is blind. And so I knew then, well, my character's gift is going to be a visual gift. If she knows that people are a match, she's not going to hear bells. She's not going to feel a tingle in her fingertips. She's going to see something. And I knew then that I loved the idea that she was going to need glasses. She was going to have very poor vision physically, but in her heart, inside, she's going to have this very amazing, wonderful, better than 20/20 inner vision, right? And all that kind of came together just from learning about this man. So it's a really interesting thing, the way that your brain, when you're working on a story, takes its twists and turns, and you start to build the characters. So I learned about this man, and I got really excited. This research was so fun. Here we have the Knishes, right? So everybody likes a Knish. I wish I had some Knishes to pass out, but I don't. So when I wrote my second book, when I wrote The Wartime Sisters, it was a World War II era book. It wasn't about the war, but it was a home front story. And it was set at the Springfield Armory, which is right near where I grew up. But because it was a World War II story, even the time period, I had to be so careful. I cannot tell you how careful I had to be with every bit of research for that story. And I could not play with it. And everything I changed, and I changed like 2 things, I had to write like a mea culpa to put at the end of the book. Because you have to be so careful. Because people take it very seriously, as they should. I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but I'm just saying it's a little, I won't write another World War II era story because I like to play. And when I read about the Knish War of 1916, the Yonah Shimel Knishri picture is just there because there aren't a lot of Knish pictures online. The Yonah Shimel Knishri was not involved in the Knish War in 1916. It was 2 different people. It was Max Green, who opened up, it was a price war basically. He opened up a Knish store on one side of the street. Somebody opened up another one across the street. He sold the Knishes for 4 cents. The guy across the street sold them for 3 cents. He brought in a band. The guy across the street started handing out coupons. If you ate enough Knishes, you won like a prize. Someone was carried out of the store, like for eating, because they ate so many that they were sick. But it was such a fun bit of history, right? So for me, well, how would I play with that? Well, to me, that was like a Romeo and Juliet story, right? It's like the Capulets and the Montagues all over again. And I knew that my matchmaker would match the son of one Knish empire to the daughter of the other Knish empire, and that would be the story. So I could do that with this book. I could have a lot of fun using it was a real thing that happened, but I could play with it in a way that made sense for my story. This is another picture that I found early on in my research. And honestly, if I could only show you one picture today, this would be the picture. This is a picture of people saying Tashlich prayers for Yom Kippur on the Williamsburg Bridge. So at the point when this picture is taken, the Williamsburg Bridge, which I think was completed around 1903, is an incredibly new structure. It's very modern. They're saying ancient prayers on a modern structure. And it's the juxtaposition of those 2 things is so poignant to me. It's so moving that they have come here to this new people, in this new modern world, we're still tied to these old traditions. And this is what I wanted to do with my story. I wanted to have the mixture of what's old and what's new, and the traditional and the modern. Because Sarah is a matchmaker, which is, we have our very first matchmaker, like, in the Torah. Like, Abraham said, that it's been around forever. But she is matching people for love, which is an incredibly modern idea. back in the 1920s, people weren't really marrying for love. I mean, maybe some people were, but it was a transactional thing. All of the matchmakers in her neighborhood are matching to make sure the families, get along, to make sure the money situation is right. They're matching, it's a career. One of the reasons why most of the matchmakers weren't all men then, but one of the reasons why they were mostly men is because it was a big money business. It wasn't like women, people didn't want to talk, the fathers of the daughters and the sons didn't want to talk to women about it. They wanted to talk to men about it because it was a business transaction. So my character Sarah is a very modern woman. She just is. What she is doing is a very modern thing. This is a picture that I love. This is a drawing of a bet din, of a rabbinical court that's meeting in London, actually, in the early 1900s. I could not find a picture of one in the US, but I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of a bet din, but it's a rabbinical court, it's a religious court. They still have them today. If you look at this picture, you'll see that the person who's sort of standing in front of the bench is like a woman with a cloche hat, right? And there's the guy next to her who looks really scary, like a very unsavory character. And I imagine that she is probably going to the court to ask for a divorce from this kind of scary looking guy, right? She's asking for what they call a get, a religious divorce, which if you read some of the articles today, you'll know this is still a problem today. Again, the more things change, the more things stay the same, right? There are men who withhold these religious divorces from their wives, and then they're in a pickle if they want to get remarried, to a religious person. And so I love this picture because to me it really shows how intimidating it would have been for a woman to go in front of a religious court. Then and today you need 3 rabbis, 3 learned men. I think in some maybe reform situations, maybe there's a female rabbi today, I don't really know. I spoke with the people of Bet Din of America, but I didn't really talk to them about the way that a Bet Din would work today. I wanted to know what they knew about how it might have worked back then when Sarah was going in front of one. And what I was told was basically it would have been, there weren't so many procedural rules. It had to be 3 men, it had to be 3 rabbis. And I asked, well, would a woman even be able to go and represent herself? And they told me that if she had a father, probably the father would go with her. But at the point in the story where Sarah appears in front of the Bet Din, she doesn't have her father anymore. He's passed. They all have different things to say. And of course, there's 24 male matchmakers who come in who are all accusing Sarah of doing all these terrible things. And she is representing herself. She's her own attorney. And then I had the idea that maybe at some point some of the women that she's matched come in to testify on her behalf, and they do. And that's actually my favorite scene in the story because the women who she has helped, who she has believed in, come in to repay, to pay back that favor and to say this is what she has done for us. And all these men here wouldn't have made these matches for us. We were not good enough for them to match us, and they ignored us. And she did what none of them would do. And so that was a very special scene, and I'm really grateful that somehow this drawing made its way to me so that I could show you sort of how I pictured it in my head when I was writing it. There's a lot of Yiddish in this book. So this saying, right? So I really wanted to give, it's a great saying. There's this saying too, this is another favorite. He bakes lies like they're bagels. So I really wanted this book to have, I wanted Sarah's chapters to have that old world flavor to them. I wanted there to be a lot of Yiddish. I wanted there to be, this book has this dose of magical realism in it, right? Which I've never done before, and which I'm so excited that I was able to do in this story. And I wanted it to feel a little magical at times. And I felt like adding some of the Yiddish, it just gave it that folksy, sort of folkloric feel to it. So some of the things, so you'll notice if you read the book, Abby's chapters don't have these headings, but Sarah's chapters all have a heading from some sort of saying. And some of them are Yiddish sayings that I sort of found. Some were things that my grandmother used to say to me, like, there's a lid for every pot, right? Some were things that Adele kind of told me about. Some I made up. I just, like, when I say the heart's big enough to hold grief and love, like that just, that was something I made up. They were just different things. But I think they added another layer to the story, and sort of texturally, just something that made me feel really good, about those chapters. I loved all of Abby's chapters too, but Sarah's chapters have these little headings for them. Maybe I should have come up with something for Abby's chapters, but I didn't feel like it needed. Abby's chapters sort of were grounding for the story. There's a little bit of magic in her story too, but hers made it feel a little bit more gritty. Hers were more of the herring in my story, and Sarah's were a little bit more of the orange blossoms, I guess. This is a saying that I kind of came across really early. I don't even know where I found it. Let there be such oneness between us that when one cries, the other tastes salt. So I don't think that this original, the way that this saying is written, was really supposed to be romantic at all. It's more like this is like talking about humanity, right? Like let's all be good citizens together. Let's all care about each other, and let's all be empathetic and be compassionate towards each other. But of course, when I thought about it a little more, I liked the idea of Sarah giving this as a piece of advice to her granddaughter, because when you make up a story that has a little bit of magic in it, you have to come up with rules. Like, how is the magic going to work, right? I want it to be consistent. What is this little bit of magic that she has, and when can she use it and when can she not use it? So I knew the number one rule: you can't find a match for yourself. It's not, that's the rule, right? Because if you could find a match for yourself, it's too easy. It's not even interesting. And I also knew I wanted to have a scene in the story where Sarah really thinks, and Abby too, they both think maybe somebody's for them, and then they see that the person is not. Because that's, not to repeat myself, but another kick in the kishkis. Like, that's a real kick the person when they're down. They think they're in love, they see that it's for someone else. And so the advice that Sarah gives her granddaughter is, when she says, Grandma, like, how does anybody know that this is the person you're supposed to be with? How do we know? And Sarah says, because when you cry, the one that you're meant for will taste the salt of your tears. Because what is more romantic and beautiful than that? To think that there's such a connection, right? That I could cry from up here and someone in the back of the room would taste the salt, because you're so connected. So that was sort of like a beautiful idea that I wanted to put in the story. This is my last slide. So after this slide, get your questions ready, because we can talk about whatever you want. But people ask me a lot about the cover. And usually, for my first two books, I really didn't have much input at all as to how, the publisher has a cover designer and they make the cover. This book, I had a new editor who's so wonderful. And she said to me, I kept thinking about ketubas. So the ketubah that's up here, that's my ketubah. So I've been married for 27 years. And I felt like, especially today, I don't know if you guys have seen on Instagram, there's so many, you can see all this beautiful ketubah. Like, just put ketubah in Instagram, and there are beautiful artists who are making ketubahs all over the world, and they're posting pictures of them, right? And they're beautiful. And it's a book about a matchmaker. So I thought I wanted to look like a ketubah. I kind of wanted it to look a little bit like my ketubah, with words in the middle and the flowers all around the edges. And then my ketubah, you'll see, it has like 4 sort of anchor symbols. It has a mezuzah and a synagogue, a Torah, and a house. And I said to my editor, as I was sending her all these pictures, I would love it if you would just put a jar of pickles on me. I want some pickles. And they did, right? And then they put the spectacle, the glasses are there, and the wedding rings, and the bracelet. The bracelet doesn't look like the bracelet I described in the book, but that's okay. The only thing that they did that I didn't want was the bride and groom, because I thought maybe that made it look too much like a romance. So actually, when I hold the book up, I don't have one up here, but when I hold the book, I can put my thumb over the book. I try to remember to do that, but I love what they did with the cover, and I love the sort of like Tinkerbell dash of glitter across the front, because it's sort of representative of what Sarah and Abby see. So there was a lot of other research that, like I said, I researched Jewish women at Barnard in that time period. There were a lot of other things that went into this story. There was research about the celebrity divorces of 1994. I picked 1994 specifically because I knew that was when Charles came out in that big documentary and said, yes, he admitted to the affair with Camilla. And now look where we are, right? Now they're going to be the queen. So, never say never. All of the research was such a joy to do. And putting this book together was really an escape for me during that really dark time. So it makes me so happy to see all of you here. And people write emails to me and tell me that it was such a joyful read. So that was really, that was what it did for me as I was writing. What it did for me as I was writing is what I hope that it will do for you when you read it, which is, to bring you that joy and that happiness. Because we all need it, especially after the, really crummy couple years that we all went through. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to take questions. Does anyone, you can raise your hand. Okay. If you say your question, I'm going to repeat it up here so that everyone can hear it. So yes.
Did you ever get to New York?
So the question was, did I ever get to New York? So yes, so I live an hour north of the city, so I do go into New York. But I eventually went, I was pretty much done with the story, but I went to the Tenement Museum, and I went, and I walked the streets of the Lower East Side. So I did get to go and kind of walk the area where my characters would be.
Did you meet any matchmakers?
Did I meet any matchmakers? I didn't meet any in person. I spoke to a lot of people on the phone. Like I said, I spoke to Eliza Ben Shalom, who is going to be your Jewish matchmaker on the Netflix show. I spoke to her over the phone. I didn't want to know really about matchmaking now. My question for the matchmakers I spoke with was really, I wanted to know if they felt it was a calling. Like, what made them do it? Why did they want to do it? And and it was really that. I was hoping, and it wasn't like I was looking for facts. I was looking more for a feeling. I wanted to know what it felt like. So
I also just want to say, everyone's going to probably laugh, but I think of myself as a matchmaker, and I have matched several people over the years. One couple, one friend is still married 55 years.
Right.
And
That's amazing.
I still have this affinity to do it.
Right.
Like I will meet somebody, I met some guy, and not for me. And I am a widow now. But the other day, I was in a grocery store, and I was in the wine aisle, of course, and I met this young guy. And
I think
we talked for 45 minutes.
That's
and I called my friend's daughter and I said,
I love your story. I don't think people can really hear you, but I love your story. I want to grab.
And I loved your book.
Right, thank you so much.
And I spell my name like yours.
Okay, oh, great. Okay, they're moving behind me. Yes. Yeah. Can you stand up? Okay.
I love the book.
Thank you.
Let me start there. The character Sarah has so many feelings, has very strong feelings.
Yeah.
And maybe it's my lack, I'm not Jewish, so it's maybe my lack of history knowing and understanding. But it struck me that in the 40s and 50s, not a lot was mentioned about the Holocaust. And I know this is a very positive book, but I wondered what your thinking was on that.
So, did everybody hear that question? Okay, so Sarah's gift really, what I wanted to do is I wanted Sarah's gift to expand and grow as she gets older and as the times change. I really wanted to, my main time period was the 1910s and 1920s for her. We do see her when she's older, we see what she's doing, and I love that she's still matching people. I don't write Holocaust literature, but I did feel that it was important just to have a mention because in the course of my research, when I did a lot of searching through the New York Times archives, and there was a point where there were so many, I was looking specifically for Jewish wedding announcements throughout just different time periods, and there were so many interesting wedding announcements that I found of refugees, of people, of Holocaust survivors who had come here, and really interesting weddings that happened when they got here. Whether they had met in the camps and then they came, all kinds of things. And so it felt to me like it would be, if you were a person who felt a calling to make matches, you would feel the need to help rebuild the community at that point in time. And I really love the idea of the rabbis in the community in New York City coming to Sarah and saying, we know that you have this gift, we know that this is your job, help us. Because before, all these men are just bullying her, basically. And then for the men to recognize her and to say, will you please help us, seemed to me to be an important kind of shift for her. So that was why I did it. But I didn't want to get too involved or bogged down in it, but I wanted to include it. So thank you for that question. Yes?
I can't think of the name, but Turner Classics. I've seen several times.
Crossing Delancey?
Yeah.
Crossing Delancey, yeah. There's a pickle man in Crossing Delancey. Yeah, and there's the grandmother's friend is a matchmaker.
Was this from you? Your writing?
No, but a lot of people love that movie. I love that movie. I do. There was a question over here. There was a woman, right?
You answered.
Oh, I answered. Okay. I'm looking to. Okay, yeah.
No, I was wondering.
Can you stand
Yes,
up?
of course. No, I was wondering if you can maybe elucidate the point of the differences and similarities between the Jewish world, matchmaking, and maybe the Indian world.
Right.
I don't. You probably are a good source to ask that question of.
Interesting. Okay, so the similarities and differences between Jewish matchmaking and Indian matchmaking. My only experience with Indian matchmaking was watching that show. But I would say like a yenta is a yenta no matter what culture you're from. A yenta is a yenta. Just like love is love is love. I thought one thing that I thought was really interesting about that show is that the woman's name is Seema, and she says, I'm Seema from Mumbai. And she says to all the people that want to match, they tell her what they want in their person. And she says, you'll get 60% of that. Don't look for everything. You'll get 60%. Because her function, and I found this when I was speaking to other modern matchmakers, whereas in Sarah's time, I think the emphasis was more really on making the match. I think the matchmakers now, Indian or Jewish or whatever, yes, they want to make a match, 100%. But they're also kind of like life coaches. They're giving this advice that's like, don't be so rigid. Mm-hmm. They're giving dating advice. Aliza does a lot of dating advice. Like, she does a lot of different like podcasts and things like to talk about that. They're trying to change the mindset of someone who hasn't found love to say like, be more open. So that's kind of what the interesting thing that I took away from the Indian matchmaking. Yeah.
I just wanted to know if this might be made into a movie or a limited series.
Oh, I hope so. Who wants to make a movie? I mean, I have a book to film agent who does that, and she sent it to so many people, but so far no bites. But maybe she did send it to Amy Sherman-Palladino, who makes Mrs. Maisel. So far no bites, but we'll see. There's someone back there. I just want to grab her, and then so could you stand up? Yeah. Hi.
I get emails from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and one of the things that they say is there is going to be a Jewish matchmaking show.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's on Netflix, and like I said, yeah, it's going to be on Netflix. I think it starts in a couple weeks, so you guys should all watch it and tell me what you think. Yes.
You do so much research.
Can you stand up?
You do so much research for your book.
Yeah.
Do you usually gather all your research and then do your writing? Do you write as you're, researching?
Right. Great question. So this is a question about process. She asked, do I research first and then do the writing? Do I kind of do both together? I research for a couple months to sort of see what's there. I need to have something in my head before I start. I can't just start writing if I don't know where I am. I need to kind of ground myself in the place and get the voice of the characters right. So for this book, I did about 2 or 3 months of research. And then of course, as I go along, I come up with questions and I have to dig back into research. But like, as I said before, I read like 3 or 4 memoirs, and those really helped to ground me. I don't know if anyone's read anything by Colm Toveen. He wrote a book called Brooklyn, but he's a wonderful, beautiful writer of historical fiction, and I heard him speak about this once. And he said, when you have to research and just like fill your brain, and then you have to forget it. Because you have to sort of distill it and have the essence of it be in your head. But if you're going to just spit it all back out, you're really writing like an encyclopedia entry, right? You're not writing a story from the heart, you're writing just facts. And if you want to write a story, you have to absorb it all and figure out then what the story is. So the research is really important. But it's also really important to kind of put it away at some point and step beyond it. Sorry? Okay, the two of you. You decide between the two of you who goes first. I don't know.
I just wondered, in relation to what you just said.
Yeah.
Do you have a preference for the research or the writing?
Oh,
Can you
right.
say which
Right.
you prefer?
So the question is, what do I prefer? Do I prefer the research or the writing? So I love all of it. When you first start researching, it's such a special time because it's like you're digging for treasure. And when you find, like, I found that picture of them on the Williamsburg Bridge, right? I find that and I'm happy all day. But you can't take the smile off my face. You find these beautiful things, but then you have to go and try to translate them. The researching is a lot easier. The researching is easier because the writing, it's really hard. Because how do I research and I get that happy feeling. It fills me up, right? It fills up my soul and I have all these feelings about that picture. But then I have to somehow find the right words to translate it and make it part of my story, and that's so hard. So the writing is much more frustrating, but I love it just as much, but it's a lot harder. And now your friend.
I wanted to know, first of all, Wartime Sisters. I love that book.
Thank you.
Love. Was that based on anybody in your family or?
So is this a multiple part question? Because if so, or was that the only question? Because I'll answer that question, because it sounds like you have another one coming. Right, okay. So tell me all the questions and then I'll answer.
Okay, the other question is, when you have so much going on in your mind, how do you get your mind to shut off to sleep?
Okay, that's a really good question. Okay, so the first question is, the Wartime Sisters, my second book, is that based on a real person? So my very first book, The Two-Family House, it's not based on anybody that I know specifically, but it was inspired by my mother's childhood homes, because my mother grew up in Brooklyn in a two-family house. And she lived upstairs there were 3 of them, 3 sisters, and then my grandmother's brother with his 3 daughters lived downstairs. So they all lived together. When my mother was 18, her family moved to Springfield, Massachusetts. And the Wartime Sisters is and Springfield, Massachusetts is where the Springfield Armory is, which is where the Wartime Sisters is set. So it's not about anybody that I knew, but my mother had these sisters. I was obsessed with my mother's sister relationship because I don't have sisters. She had 2 of them, and there was always one who they were mad at. There were always like 2 getting up on. And it was back when we still had like actual phones, so whenever they would talk, I would go upstairs and like listen in on the conversation. And I loved this idea of writing a book about, my mom stayed in Brooklyn for a little bit because she was a senior in high school, and the rest of the family left. And I loved this idea about writing about someone being left behind, which is what happens in the Wartime Sisters. And sort of something that I think is really interesting is when you have siblings, but they're socioeconomically end up in different places. That's a very, interesting, difficult sort of conundrum, which happens a lot in many, many families. So that's what all that is. The second question that this lovely woman asked is, if I have all these things in my head, how do I ever rest? How do I shut down my brain? I'm really a terrible listener sometimes. Like my husband will have an entire conversation with me, and then I'll say, and then he'll say, so I'll ask the question, which is say, I just spent 20 minutes explaining that to you, because I'll be thinking about a story. So the answer is, I don't do it very well. I don't know, I really love to just think about my stories. So I'm not tormented, or anything by it, but I do sometimes I'm not as present as I should be with people. Yep, see, I knew you had a lot of questions. Okay, okay.
I live
Yeah.
in books.
Thank
I
you.
know you've only written the 2 and now you have the new one, I haven't read it yet. But I just wanted to know, how many hours a day do you spend writing?
Okay, how many hours a day do I spend writing? So when I wrote The Two-Family House, it took me 5 years to write it because I was just learning to write. And my kids were much younger, they were living at home. I would write a little bit every day. Now they're both gone, my son is in college, my daughter has been out of college for 2 years. I have all day to write, and I write every day. And writing, when I say I write every day, doesn't always mean writing. I touch my story every day in some way. I'm researching something for it, I'm thinking about it, I'm sitting there staring at it. I could write 1 sentence. But every day I do that, because if I don't do that, even on Saturday, Sunday, whatever it is, if I don't do that, then the next day, if I let it go for too long, when I go back to it, I have to really re-immerse myself. And that's hard. So it's a rare time when I'm not really in the book a little bit every day. Yes.
Pam Janoff, who blurbed your book,
Yes.
is also a former lawyer.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, what was it about the law that led you to writing, or vice versa? And what, did you become disillusioned with the law, or were you always
Yes.
just a writer at heart?
So this is a question about, Pam Janoff, who I'm sure a lot of you guys know, is a very lovely woman. She's a friend and she's a writer. She blurbed my book and she was a lawyer too. She actually she's a professor. She teaches law. So there are a lot of ex-lawyers who become writers, and especially people who are my age. I graduated from college in 1990. And there were a lot of English majors. I don't know if you guys have read the articles in the newspaper that say is the English major dead?
Yes.
There aren't as many humanities majors. It's a lot of STEM and different things. So there were so many of us, and we all went to law school because none of us knew what to do with our English degree. There were a lot of us, and I think a lot of us went to law school, maybe not necessarily, again, not really wanting to be a lawyer, but they used to say to us, you like to read and write, you'll be a good lawyer. But that's really not true. So for me, I practiced for 8.5 years. Then I worked part-time a little bit. I would say a total of maybe 10-ish years. And I never loved it. When I was a trust and estates lawyer, and what I loved were the stories and the family drama. And that was why I wanted to be a trust and estates lawyer. And my very first assignment, when I was a summer associate at a firm in New York City, my very first assignment was given to me by this man who was right out of Central Casting. He was 6'2", and he wore a bow tie and suspenders. And it was a really big law firm. It was Milbank Tweed in downtown Manhattan. And his name, I'm not even kidding, he has since passed away. He was a very lovely man. His name was Squire Bozorth. So Squire was his first name. Yeah. So he was really from a movie. And he had gray hair and glasses, and he was a very elegant gentleman. And he sat me down in his office. I was 23 years old, and he said, "This is your assignment." And he described this situation to me, which was he had this client who was a Greek shipping magnate. And the guy his wife was in a psychiatric hospital in Switzerland, and he had illegitimate children in a couple different countries. And I was just sitting there oh my God, this is the area of law for me. And then he gave me the assignment, which was research the intestacy laws of these countries. And I did not care I did not give, a rat's you-know-what for this assignment. I didn't care about the law. I wanted to hear more about this man and his wife and their illegitimate children. And that's what I always loved. I should have known right then and there that I should really be. I wanted to go out of his office and go to my office and write a story about the man. And I had to do the assignment, and that was where it all fell apart. But anyway, okay, sorry, yes.
I'd like to know if you've gone back to the book that you were writing before you
Right. Such a good question.
put down.
Yes.
And if so, when can we expect it?
So, great question. Did I go back to the book I was working on? I will. I did not. The reason that I did not was that after I wrote this book, and I got to play with the magical realism, I kind of wanted to do it again. And so my next book, on Sunday, just sent my edited version to my editor. So that book will come in 2024. That book, so what, my husband's great grandmother was a pharmacist, and she graduated from pharmacy school in 1921, which is really fascinating. So she's sort of the inspiration for the next book. And pharmacies are great places to play with magical realism because there's all these pills and powders and potions and, you can do a lot. So it's a really fun story. It'll be out in 2024. The title tentatively, there's an O. Henry short story, which you can read online. It's called The Love Filter, Piltre, which means like a potion. The Love Filter of Heike Schonstein. And it's about a pharmacist who gets in trouble with a love potion. In 1906, he wrote that. And so the title of my story is called The Love Elixir of Augusta Stern, because my husband's great-grandmother's name was Augusta. So I gave her the title. So it's a really fun book. It's a really fun book. So I'll post more about that. You guys can follow, if any of you, I'm on Facebook. It's just my name, Lynda Cohen Loigman. You can follow me there or whatever, and I post stuff. So you can also sign up for my newsletter, though I hate to tell you, I really have to get on the newsletter thing. I'm not very good about it. But I will be. I'll get better. That book will come out, and then I'll come back, and you'll see me again, and we'll talk about it. But, do we have time for, okay, one more question? One more, or no? Or we're just gonna, okay, we're gonna take this book. Okay, how long did it take you? It took a year for this. You guys, thank you so much.